On a foggy morning at Valor Hills National Cemetery, a solemn silence wrapped around rows of gleaming white headstones, stretching endlessly. Each stone whispered a story tales of sacrifice, courage, and unwavering love for the country. Families, fellow soldiers, and military officials gathered quietly united in remembrance of those who gave everything. Among them stood General William Harper, a towering figure of resilience and honor whose recent passing brought the community together in grief and respect. The air was thick with reverence. The sound of distant drums echoed softly, blending with the national anthem sung by a somber choir. It was a moment when differences faded and all hearts beat in unison, honoring the fallen. But then, breaking through the stillness, came an unexpected disruption. Derek Collins, a 38-year-old police sergeant with a history as checkered as his expression, was hard strode into the gathering. His presence was not one of respect or mourning. Instead, his sharp gaze and rigid posture spoke of authority wielded without empathy. The crowd noticed immediately. A ripple of unease passed through the attendees. Collins advanced toward the funeral procession, his every step seeming to carry an unspoken warning. What was meant to be a day of honor and peace suddenly felt charged, as if the fragile calm was about to shatter. Behind the polished badge and uniform was a man whose record was marred by multiple complaints, 6 official internal investigations for racial bias and excessive force, none resulting in serious consequences. Collins was no stranger to controversy, yet the system had repeatedly shielded him from accountability. The neighborhood of Washington Heights, where this unsettling scene unfolded, was largely white, with a deep-seated history of racial tension simmering beneath its surface. Incidents of bias and discrimination had long cast shadows over this community, though few had escalated to this level of public confrontation. In the midst of this tense atmosphere stood Marcus Reed, a 30-year-old former Navy SEAL. A man who had faced the fiercest battles overseas, yet now found himself confronted on home soil, not by an enemy combatant, but by the very authority meant to protect him. ID Collins demanded sharply, his eyes scanning Marcus with suspicion, as though the uniform he once proudly wore counted for nothing. Marcus remained calm, voice steady, yet resolute. "Sir, I'm exercising my right to walk freely here. I don't have to show ID without cause." The calmness in Marcus's voice contrasted sharply with the mounting tension. But Collins was unyielding. His tone grew harsher, his actions more aggressive, pushing past reason to exert control. Shock and hurt flickered across Marcus's face. How could someone who had served his country with honor be met with suspicion and force simply because of his skin color? Around them, bystanders started pulling out of phones, capturing every moment. They knew this was more than a routine stop. It was evidence of something far deeper. The video soon spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and calls for justice. Yet beneath this viral moment lay a complex web of systemic racism, unchecked power, and a law enforcement culture that had long protected its own at the expense of fairness and human dignity. This opening chapter sets the stage not just for a story about a single encounter, but for a journey into the heart of a broken system. It invites us to walk alongside Marcus, to understand his strength forged in combat and his courage now tested in the streets he calls home. At the same time, it challenges us to confront the reality of officers like Derek Collins, men who exploit their badges shielded by institutional silence, perpetuating cycles of abuse. All of this begins on a day that should have been marked only by respect, but instead ignited a powerful movement, a fight for justice that would ripple far beyond the cemetery gates. Before we get into the main story, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is. We'd love to see how far this story has traveled and who it's touching along the way. All right, let's get started. General Lillian Grant stood tall, her posture commanding, yet graceful, embodying the very essence of resilience. At 52 years old, she was one of the highest-ranking Black female generals in the United States Army, a symbol of perseverance and triumph against daunting odds. Her journey was anything but easy, a path carved through decades of systemic obstacles, subtle biases, and outright discrimination. Born in a small town in Mississippi, Lillian grew up witnessing the harsh realities of racial inequality. From a young age, she was determined to break barriers to prove that strength and leadership were not confined by race or gender. Her father, a Vietnam War veteran, instilled in her a deep sense of duty and honor, while her mother, a schoolteacher, nurtured her intellect and unshakable moral compass. Lillian's military career was marked by countless challenges that tested her spirit. Early on, she faced skepticism and prejudice in a predominantly white male institution. Many questioned her capabilities, doubted her resolve, yet she met every doubt with excellence. From grueling training camps to complex command assignments overseas, she distinguished herself through leadership, strategic acumen, and an unbreakable will. Despite her rank and achievements, Lillian never forgot the struggles of those like Marcus Reed, the young black Navy SEAL she would soon come to defend. For her, Marcus's fight was personal. It reflected the ongoing battle against a system that often failed to recognize the humanity of black men and women, even those who served their country with valor. Her reputation extended beyond the military halls. She was revered in her community as a mentor, an advocate for justice, and a voice for the marginalized. She spoke candidly about her experiences with racism and sexism, encouraging young women and people of color to rise above adversity and demand equality. In the days following the incident at Valor Hills, General Grant's involvement would shift the narrative. Her voice would bring not just attention, but a profound weight of authority and moral clarity. When she entered the courtroom to support Marcus, it was more than an act of solidarity. It was a declaration that injustice would no longer be tolerated. Her presence challenged the image of the military and law enforcement as unyielding institutions, reminding everyone that within these walls were individuals committed to change. The story of General Lillian Grant was a testament to the power of resilience, the impact of representation, and the hope that courage can inspire. Her strength was not just in her medals or her rank. It was in her unwavering belief that justice must prevail, and that every voice, no matter how long silenced, deserved to be heard. Officer Derek Bennett was 38 years old, an experienced member of the city police department with more than a decade of service under his belt. To the public, he was just another officer in uniform, a figure meant to embody safety and authority. But beneath the badge and the crisp patrol uniform, there was a story far darker than most imagined. Derek's record was a trail of complaints, 6 formal allegations related to racial profiling, excessive force, and verbal abuse. Yet surprisingly, none of these complaints had led to significant disciplinary action. His superiors either overlooked these incidents or dismissed them as the rough edges of a tough job. This pattern reflected a deeper issue, a system reluctant to hold its own accountable. The precinct where Derek worked was steeped in a culture that often rewarded aggression over empathy. Stories circulated quietly about officers who pushed limits and faced little consequence. The blue wall of silence was very real here, a code that discouraged speaking out against fellow officers. Pressure to conform, to toughen up, and to assert control often led officers to act in ways that blurred ethical lines. Derek was no exception. His colleagues knew him as by-the-book in appearance, but quick to escalate situations when tensions rose. The stress of patrolling a city rife with social unrest, economic disparity, and deep-rooted mistrust weighed heavily on him. Yet rather than finding constructive ways to manage this pressure, Derek often responded with hostility and dominance. What drove him to repeatedly cross boundaries? Was it a personal bias, the result of his upbringing, or the influence of the institutional culture? Conversations with former co-workers revealed a man shaped by years of hardened policing, a man who saw the world through a lens colored by suspicion, especially toward minority communities. He had grown up in a small suburban town removed from diverse communities and joined the force with a desire for order and control. Over time, however, the daily encounters with tension, fear, and danger hardened him. His inability or unwillingness to adapt his mindset led him to make critical errors. In the days leading up to the incident with General Lillian Grant and Marcus Reed, Derek had been involved in several confrontations that raised eyebrows. Yet no formal intervention came. The department's reluctance to discipline him fostered an environment where misconduct could fester unchecked. This failure to act not only put innocent people at risk, but also eroded public trust in law enforcement. Derek's behavior was symptomatic of a broader systemic problem, one that intertwined personal prejudice, flawed oversight, and a culture resistant to change. Understanding Derek Bennett's story is crucial to grasping how the tragic encounter unfolded. He was more than an individual acting out of line. He was a product of an environment that shielded him and reinforced harmful patterns. The following narrative will peel back layers of this environment, examining the pressures Derek faced, the choices he made, and the ripple effects that shook a community and a nation. Time. Washington Heights. At first glance, it might seem like just another quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of a bustling city. Tree-lined streets, modest houses with white picket fences, families waving hello to neighbors as they walk their dogs. Yet beneath this calm surface lies a simmering tension, a divide that has shaped the lives of everyone who calls this place home. The neighborhood was predominantly white, its residents largely insulated from the racial and cultural diversity found just a few miles away. For decades, Washington Heights had been known as a place where old traditions lingered, sometimes stubbornly resisting the changes sweeping through the rest of the city. It was a place where even today the echoes of past prejudices whispered quietly through its streets. The demographic makeup created an invisible barrier not marked by fences or signs, but by an unspoken wariness that many people carried. For the few Black families living there, daily life was a delicate balancing act between belonging and exclusion. Neighborhood children played together, but unspoken lines were often drawn in the sand when it came to trust and community acceptance. Over the years, Washington Heights had seen its share of incidents that mirrored national tensions. Local news occasionally reported on altercations between residents and police, moments when authority clashed with the community's call for respect and justice. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern, each one leaving a scar, each one reinforcing suspicions on both sides. The history of these confrontations was embedded in the collective memory. Stories were shared quietly over kitchen tables and in church basements, stories of nights when officers responded with force rather than understanding, of neighbors who felt targeted for nothing more than the color of their skin. This backdrop set the stage for what was about to unfold on a cool autumn evening. The air carried the weight of those past encounters, the weight of unspoken grievances and unresolved fears. Washington Heights wasn't just a location, it was a character in this story, a place where history and tension converged to create a fragile and volatile environment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows lengthened across the streets, where Marcus Reed, a decorated military veteran, chose to walk home. Unbeknownst to him, those shadows would soon deepen into something far more ominous. It was a crisp evening in Washington Heights when Marcus Reed, a 30-year-old Black military veteran, set out for a routine walk back home. Marcus was no stranger to discipline and composure. Years in service had forged a man who knew the value of patience, respect, and quiet strength. Yet on this particular night, as he took measured steps along the familiar streets, an unexpected and unwarranted interruption awaited him. Sergeant Derek Bennett, a 38-year-old police officer with a history of complaints, stood like an unyielding sentinel at the corner. His gaze locked onto Marcus as if sensing a threat where none existed. What started as a simple walk was about to morph into a tense confrontation. "Hey, you there," Bennett called out sharply. His voice cut through the evening calm, authoritative and cold. Marcus stopped his calm exterior steadying as he turned to face the officer. "Yes, officer, can I help you?" Without explanation, Bennett stepped closer, his posture rigid and aggressive. "What are you doing walking around here? Got any ID on you?" Marcus blinked in mild surprise but remained composed. "I'm just walking home from the gym. Here's my ID," he said, pulling out his military ID card with deliberate care. But Bennett was not appeased. "I need to see something else." "Papers proof. You're acting suspicious," he asserted, his tone implying guilt without cause. Marcus's mind raced, but his voice remained calm. "Sir, I'm a veteran living here. I know my rights. I'd like to understand why I'm being stopped." The officer's expression hardened. "It's not about your rights right now. You're under suspicion, and I'm doing my job." Marcus felt a flicker of disbelief. This was a man sworn to protect and serve, yet here he was, wielding authority like a weapon, demanding justification where none existed. The uniform that should have been a symbol of security was now a barrier between a man and his freedom. Bennett's next move escalated the situation. "Step over here and keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus complied, knowing resistance could only make things worse. But the feeling of being watched through a lens of prejudice was suffocating. He recalled his days in the military where respect and honor were the currency, not suspicion and fear. "Officer, please, I'm not a threat," Marcus said softly, his words weighed with years of restraint and discipline. Bennett's response was a dismissive scoff. "You think your service means anything here? Rules are rules." As Bennett reached to cuff Marcus, the tension became palpable, drawing the attention of nearby residents and passersby. Yet through it all, Marcus held on to his calmness, his faith in justice, even as he was subjected to unjust treatment. The scene was a stark reminder of the invisible line Marcus walked daily, a veteran who had served his country with honor yet was still viewed through the narrow lens of racial bias by those sworn to protect. This confrontation wasn't just an isolated event, it was a mirror reflecting a broader systemic issue. It was about power misused about rights, ignored about a man forced to defend his dignity, not on a battlefield, but on a quiet street in his own neighborhood. As the moments stretched, Marcus's voice rose not in anger, but in resolve. "I'm here. I'm a citizen, and I deserve respect." This was the beginning of a story that would shake Washington Heights and resonate far beyond. A story of courage in the face of injustice, of strength when wronged, and the unyielding fight for dignity and equality. The evening air in Washington Heights had grown tense, almost electric, as the confrontation between Marcus Reed and Sergeant Derek Bennett intensified. What began as a routine check had rapidly spiraled into an alarming display of unchecked authority and power abused in public view. Bennett's demeanor shifted abruptly. His voice, once simply demanding, grew harsher, edged with a threatening tone. "I told you, you're not making this easier on yourself. Comply or face the consequences." Marcus's heart raced, confusion mingling with a quiet fear that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the weight of an unjust accusation. He was a decorated veteran, a man who had faced real danger on distant battlefields with courage and honor. And yet here under the glaring streetlights, he found himself at the mercy of a man who seemed intoxicated by his own power. "Sir, I'm just asking for your name and badge number," Marcus said calmly, trying to defuse the situation. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the shock of what was unfolding. Instead of answering, Bennett's hand moved abruptly, grabbing Marcus's arm with a grip that was firm, too firm, and far beyond what was necessary. "Enough talk. You're coming with me." Marcus winced at the roughness. "Please, I'm not resisting. Let's just do this the right way." But Bennett's patience had run thin. He pulled out his baton, waving it in a manner meant to intimidate, not to protect. "Don't make me use this." At that moment, the neighborhood street seemed to hold its breath. Passers-by slowed. Some started pulling out their phones, sensing that something was wrong. But for Marcus, the shock was more than just physical, it was deeply personal. The man wielding the baton was meant to uphold justice, yet his actions screamed otherwise. "You don't know who I am," Marcus said, voice barely above a whisper, pain creeping in. "I serve this country." Bennett sneered, "And that means nothing here." The words hit like a slap, cutting deeper than any physical blow. Marcus's mind flashed back to his military days, discipline, honor, respect earned through sacrifice. Here in his own community, those values were trampled underfoot. The tension broke as Bennett suddenly shoved Marcus against a nearby wall. The impact sent a shock through Marcus's body. He struggled to steady himself, but Bennett wasn't done. More officers had now gathered, forming an intimidating circle. "Hands behind your back." Now Bennett barked. Marcus moved slowly, knowing any sudden move might be used against him. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. He glanced at the growing crowd, their faces blurred, some recording, some gasping, others frozen in shock. "I'm not your enemy," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of both pain and resolve. "I'm your neighbor, your veteran, your friend." Bennett ignored the plea, his eyes hard and unyielding. To him, Marcus was just another suspect, another face to be controlled, another case of suspected troublemaker. As Marcus was led away, the street buzzed with whispers. The bystanders felt the sting of injustice firsthand. Some voices rose in anger, others in disbelief. One thing was clear, the night had unveiled a grim reality, a reality where power had been misused, where the badge shielded not honor but prejudice. For Marcus, this moment marked not only a personal ordeal, but a reflection of a deeper systemic failure. It was a painful reminder that no amount of service or sacrifice could always shield one from discrimination. The true battle wasn't just against external enemies, but against the very systems that were supposed to protect and serve. In the days that followed, the story would spread beyond Washington Heights. The video footage, raw and unfiltered, captured the stark contrast between a disciplined veteran and an officer abusing his authority. It ignited conversations about race justice and the urgent need for reform. Yet through it all, Marcus's spirit remained unbroken. His calm dignity in the face of aggression spoke louder than any words. He became a symbol, not just of a single incident, but of countless others silenced by fear, misunderstanding, and abuse. This was not just a confrontation. It was a call to action, a call to examine the misuse of power, to confront prejudice where it hides behind uniforms, and to demand respect for every human being, regardless of color or background. And as the night grew darker, Marcus's resolve only grew stronger. Because in the fight for justice, silence is not an option. Gishamam. As the tension between Marcus and Officer Derek Bennett escalated on that humid summer evening in Washington Heights, an unexpected group of heroes emerged: the Bystanders. Ordinary people hidden in the shadows of that tense street corner reached for their phones with shaking hands, fingers hovering over record buttons. What started as silent observation quickly turned into a powerful act of resistance documentation. One young woman, Jenna, had just stepped out of a nearby convenience store when she spotted the commotion. Her heart pounded as she raised her phone, framing the scene with trembling hands. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, barely audible. Her video captured every detail: the harsh grip on Marcus's arm, the cold, unyielding glare of Bennett, and Marcus's calm yet determined demeanor. As Jenna's live stream began, more phones came out, more eyes focused on the injustice unfolding in real time. Within minutes, dozens of videos circulated across social media platforms: Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, each clip sparking conversations, outrage, and calls for accountability. The raw footage was a stark contrast to official reports that often downplayed or obscured facts. It was unedited, unfiltered, and undeniable. The impact was immediate and profound. Online communities rallied around Marcus, sharing the videos with hashtags like #HowJusticeForMarcus and #Hold the Badge Accountable. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage, others sharing similar experiences of abuse or discrimination. The videos brought a human face to systemic issues many had only read about in headlines or seen in fragmented news clips. The power of these recordings transcended geography and demographics. In small towns and big cities alike, people who had never met Marcus felt connected to his struggle. The videos became a catalyst for public discourse about police misconduct, racial profiling, and the urgent need for reform. Local activists seized the momentum. Community leaders organized peaceful rallies and forums to discuss not just Marcus's case, but the broader pattern of unchecked authority that had long plagued marginalized communities. These gatherings weren't just protests, they were spaces for healing, education, and strategic planning. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted on law enforcement and city officials. The police department, initially silent and defensive, was forced to respond. Public relations teams scrambled to manage the fallout, issuing statements promising investigations, transparency, and accountability. Yet for many, these words rang hollow without tangible action. Marcus himself was overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight. "I never wanted this," he said in a later interview. "I just wanted to be treated like any other citizen with respect. But if my experience can shine a light on these problems and help others, then I'll stand strong." Behind the scenes, legal teams began preparing for the battles ahead, buoyed by the unprecedented public support fueled by the viral videos. The footage provided undeniable evidence that would be critical in court, shifting the narrative from he said, she said to a documented reality. However, this new power, the power of recording, and also revealed the challenges and dangers faced by witnesses and activists. Some bystanders faced intimidation and threats, warnings to stay silent. Others grappled with the emotional weight of witnessing trauma and the responsibility of sharing it with the world. The story of Marcus's confrontation, amplified by those who dared to record, became more than just an incident. It became a symbol of the changing landscape of justice in the digital age. No longer could abuses hide in shadows or be swept under the rug. Cameras in every pocket meant accountability was possible, but it also demanded courage from everyday citizens to speak up. In this new era, the act of simply pressing record became a powerful weapon against injustice, a tool that turned passive observation into active resistance. And as Marcus's story unfolded on screens across the nation, it reminded us all that sometimes the most profound acts of courage come not from those in uniform, but from those brave enough to witness and speak out. The echoes of that night in Washington Heights would ripple far beyond the neighborhood streets. They ignited a movement, one fueled by truth, transparency, and the unwavering belief that justice could no longer be silenced. In the wake of the viral footage capturing Marcus's unjust encounter, a larger, more insidious story began to surface, one that has long haunted American society: systemic racism within law enforcement. This is a beast that operates not through isolated incidents, but through entrenched structures and cultures that perpetuate bias, discrimination, and abuse. Marcus's experience was not an anomaly. It was part of a tragic pattern that has echoed through decades of history, tying his story to those of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless others whose lives were forever altered or ended by systemic failures. To understand this, we must first grasp what systemic racism means within policing. It is not just the overt acts of individual officers, but the deeper currents of policies, practices, and attitudes that create an environment where bias thrives unchecked. When Derek Bennett stopped Marcus without reasonable cause, he wasn't acting in a vacuum. His actions were shaped by years of implicit bias training, departmental culture, and the societal stereotypes about race and authority that continue to influence behavior, often unconsciously. Experts point to how police departments have historically been tools of social control, originally designed to enforce laws that marginalize people of color. This legacy has embedded a mindset that associates Blackness with suspicion and threat, influencing decisions from whom to stop to how force is applied. The cases of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor stand as painful landmarks. Floyd's death under the knee of an officer sparked a global reckoning, unveiling the lethal consequences of unchecked power and racial prejudice. Taylor's tragic shooting in her own home highlighted the fatal consequences of systemic disregard for Black lives. Marcus's case added another chapter to this narrative. His military service, discipline, and character did little to shield him from the suspicion and aggression that so many Black Americans face daily. It underscored that no badge or uniform is immune to the biases ingrained in the system. Further analysis revealed that internal police cultures often discourage officers from speaking out against misconduct, fostering silence and complicity. Complaints about Bennett's prior behavior were reportedly ignored, a familiar tale reflecting a widespread problem of accountability gaps. This silence isn't accidental. It's a symptom of the blue wall, an unspoken code that protects officers at the expense of justice and public trust. This code perpetuates a cycle where abuses remain hidden and unpunished, emboldening those who wield their authority irresponsibly. Understanding systemic racism also means recognizing how policies disproportionately target minority communities. From stop and frisk tactics to harsher sentencing laws and enforcement strategies often reflect and reinforce racial disparities. Marcus's story became a catalyst for renewed discussion on reform. Activists and scholars called for dismantling not just individual bad actors, but the systems enabling them. They advocated for comprehensive training addressing implicit bias, transparent disciplinary processes, community oversight, and policies prioritizing de-escalation. However, change faces resistance. Institutions built over decades resist rapid transformation. Some within law enforcement argue that calls for reform undermine their authority or morale, while others deny the existence of systemic issues altogether. Despite these challenges, Marcus's ordeal helped fuel a broader awareness that racial bias in policing is not a relic of the past, but a present-day reality demanding urgent action. It reminded the public that behind every viral video or court case is a larger story, a story of entrenched inequality, and the urgent need to rebuild trust between police in the communities they serve. In classrooms, community forums, and legislative halls, Marcus's story joined those of Floyd and Taylor as evidence in the ongoing struggle to expose and eradicate systemic racism. The fight is far from over, but awareness is the first step toward justice. This hidden enemy, systemic racism, is not defeated by isolated acts of accountability alone. It requires collective courage to confront uncomfortable truths, overhaul policies, and nurture a culture of equity and respect. As listeners, we are called not just to witness, but to understand and act to support reforms, to amplify voices like Marcus's, and to demand a future where such stories become relics of a bygone era. The challenge is immense. The stakes are high. But through stories like Marcus's, hope persists, hope that one day the scales of justice will balance fairly for all. Yes. Marcus wasn't just any man walking the streets of Washington Heights that day. Beneath his calm exterior lay a story forged in the crucible of military service, a story of strength, resilience, and battles fought both on foreign soil and within the ranks of the armed forces. To truly understand Marcus, to grasp the depth of the injustice he endured, we need to journey back to where it all began, his years in the military, where he proved his mettle not just as a soldier, but as a man confronting layers of prejudice alongside the enemy abroad. From the moment Marcus enlisted, he was aware that his path would be anything but easy. As a young black man stepping into a predominantly white institution, he faced challenges that transcended the physical rigors of military training. He encountered stereotypes, whispered doubts, in moments where his loyalty and capability were questioned not by enemies, but by comrades sworn to fight alongside him. His basic training was brutal. The drill sergeants pushed him to his limits, demanding physical endurance and mental toughness. Marcus pushed back, determined to prove he belonged. "This is where I belong," he would tell himself. "I am more than the color of my skin." But even as he excelled, earning commendations and respect for his skills, the subtle undercurrents of racial bias persisted. Promotions came slower, praise was less frequent, and he learned early on that his presence was often met with suspicion or resentment. Marcus's deployment to conflict zones revealed a different kind of battle. Under the harsh desert sun or in dense jungle terrains, he witnessed the horrors of war, the loss of comrades, the chaos of combat. But even amidst this turmoil, the fractures of racism remained. He recalls times when black soldiers were assigned more dangerous tasks or overlooked for leadership roles despite clear merit. "The enemy wasn't always across the border," he once said in a rare interview. "Sometimes it was the uniform beside you." Despite these obstacles, Marcus's spirit never broke. He became a sniper, a position demanding precision, patience, and nerves of steel. His skills saved lives, including those of fellow soldiers who had once doubted him. "In the field, when the stakes are life and death, race doesn't matter," he explained. "It's about trust. It's about who has your back." Yet outside the battlefield, back at base, or in social settings, those old biases resurfaced, officers who avoided him, whispers behind closed doors, and a constant pressure to prove he was more than just a black soldier. These experiences shaped Marcus not only as a soldier, but as a man aware of the complexities of race in America's military. His story is a testament to perseverance and strength, but also a reminder that even institutions that preach unity and discipline can harbor deep divisions. When Marcus finally returned home, he hoped for a life of peace and respect. He had served his country with honor, risked his life in its name. But that day in Washington Heights, when Officer Derek Bennett confronted him on the street, those hopes were shattered. Bennett's suspicion, his disregard for Marcus's identity, and sacrifice cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Marcus's military background gave him a unique perspective in that confrontation. He remained calm, knowing the value of restraint. He understood protocol, knew his rights. Yet even with all his training and experience, he was not immune to the sting of racial profiling and abuse of power. It was a bitter irony, a soldier trained to protect his nation being treated as a suspect simply because of the color of his skin. This moment reveals a harsh truth: strength alone is not enough to shield against systemic injustice. Marcus's military journey, filled with courage and resilience, highlights how deeply racism is woven into the fabric of society, even in places designed to protect and serve. Through Marcus's story, we see the complexities of identity and valor. He embodies a paradox, a warrior for his country who must still fight for his dignity at home. His experience challenges us to rethink assumptions about race, service, and justice. Moreover, Marcus's journey forces us to confront how military service intersects with social inequalities. It raises critical questions. How do institutions that promote equality on paper fail their own members in practice? What can be done to dismantle the subtle systemic barriers that limit true inclusion and respect? These reflections are not just academic. They bear real consequences for countless veterans like Marcus. Many return from service hoping to find gratitude and fairness, but instead face discrimination and neglect. Marcus's story brings this reality to light, demanding attention and action. As listeners, we must appreciate the full scope of Marcus's identity, not just as a victim of police misconduct, but as a decorated veteran whose life embodies the contradictions of American society. His military journey is more than background. It is the foundation of his dignity and the reason why the injustice he faced strikes so deeply. In telling Marcus's story, we honor the strength it took to endure both war abroad and prejudice at home. We acknowledge the courage to stand tall despite systemic forces stacked against him. And we commit ourselves to listening, learning, and pushing for a society where service and sacrifice are met with respect and justice regardless of race. This chapter of Marcus's life reminds us that change must come not only in our streets and courts, but also within the very institutions meant to defend our freedoms. Because true strength lies not only in the battlefield, but in the courage to demand equality in every corner of our nation. The air was thick with tension as Marcus and Officer Derek Bennett faced each other on the cracked sidewalk of Washington Heights. It wasn't just an ordinary street encounter. It was a collision between two very different worlds, one shaped by years of service, sacrifice, and dignity, the other by unchecked authority and prejudice. Marcus's calmness stood out starkly against Bennett's aggressive posture. At 30 years old, Marcus carried the weight of a veteran's discipline and a survivor's resilience. He knew his rights. He understood the law. More than that, he knew the importance of holding his ground, not with fists, but with steadfast resolve. Bennett, meanwhile, was a man hardened by years in the force, burdened by his own demons and biases. The officer's history was a roadmap of warnings, ignored complaints about excessive force, whispers of racial profiling, all brushed aside by a system eager to protect its own. Today, Bennett saw Marcus not as a man, but as a target, a figure to control, to intimidate. License and ID, now Bennett barked, voice laced with impatience. There was no room for discussion, no invitation for understanding. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a gesture not of surrender, but of peace. Officer, I'm happy to cooperate, but may I ask why I'm being stopped? What's the reason? The question, simple and lawful, hung in the air like a challenge. Bennett's eyes narrowed. You're acting suspicious. That's enough. Suspicious because I'm walking down my neighborhood? Because I'm a black man. Marcus's voice was steady, controlled. There was no anger, just a quiet determination to speak truth to power. A crowd began to gather, sensing the brewing storm. Some faces were anxious, others wary, but all watching closely. Step aside, let me see your ID, Bennett ordered again, moving closer. Marcus complied, pulling his wallet from his pocket with deliberate calm. Here it is, he said, holding out his military ID. I'm Marcus Williams. I served in the Army for 8 years. Bennett glanced at the ID, but it did little to soften his demeanor. That doesn't change anything. At that moment, Marcus knew the encounter was about more than papers or protocols. It was a test of his patience, his dignity, his resolve. Officer Marcus said gently but firmly, I respect your duty, but I also have rights. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just walking home. Bennett scoffed. You think just because you wear a uniform on your ID, you're above suspicion? No, Marcus replied. I'm saying everyone deserves respect and fairness, even me. The tension escalated quickly. Bennett's voice grew louder, his tone sharper. Enough talking. Put your hands behind your back. Marcus froze. The words hit him like a blow. For what? I haven't done anything wrong. You're under arrest for resisting, Bennett snapped, moving to grab Marcus's arm. It was a pivotal moment. Marcus's instincts from military training kicked in. He didn't resist physically, but refused to escalate the situation with aggression. "Please," Marcus said, voice steady, "I'm cooperating. There's no need for this." Yet Bennett's grip tightened, and with a force disproportionate to the situation, he began to cuff Marcus's wrists. The crowd murmured some filming, others shouting in protest. But Marcus stayed composed, mindful that any reaction could be twisted against him. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked, eyes locked on Bennett's. "I serve my country. I followed the law. Why am I being treated like this?" Bennett didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes of fear, prejudice, and a broken system that protects the powerful rather than the just. This face-off was more than a clash of two men. It was a confrontation between justice and injustice, between dignity and abuse, between the promise of equality and the harsh reality of discrimination. Marcus's determination not to break, not to be silenced, was a beacon of hope for all who witnessed the scene. His resolve to stand tall, even in the face of unfairness and force, reflected a deeper courage, one that transcended the personal and spoke to the universal fight for respect and human rights. As the crowd grew and the tension simmered, Marcus's story became a symbol of every person who has ever been stopped, questioned, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. A reminder that standing up for one's rights is not just an act of defiance, but an act of dignity. In that charged moment on the street, Marcus taught a lesson far beyond his words, a lesson about strength, patience, and the unyielding spirit of justice. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus's wrists, a wave of shock rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. What began as a routine walk home had spiraled into an unsettling display of power, a respected military veteran, being subdued by a police officer on a busy street in Washington Heights. Voices started to rise, some in disbelief, others in outrage. "Why is this happening?" An elderly woman muttered, her eyes wide with confusion and concern. "He's done nothing wrong." Her words echoed the thoughts of many who watched helplessly. Marcus's family wasn't far behind, rushing to the scene after word spread. His wife, Sarah, her voice trembling with fear and anger, called out, "Marcus, what's going on? Please tell him to stop." Her son, only 8 years old, clung tightly to her side, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding its implications. The bystanders, many of whom had smartphones in hand, began recording. Cell phones illuminated the faces of witnesses, capturing every second, each angle a testament to the injustice unfolding before their eyes. The video quickly found its way online, uploaded and shared within minutes on platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and #Stop Police Brutality surged as thousands across the country tuned in, shocked and angered by the footage. Comments poured in, messages of support, outrage, and calls for accountability flooded timelines and feeds. "This isn't just about Marcus," wrote one user. "It's about the systemic racism that still plagues our police forces. We need change now." Another added, "I serve my country too, and I would never expect this treatment. No one should." Local activists seized the moment. Community leaders organized impromptu protests outside the police precinct in City Hall, demanding transparency and reform. Signs, waving, chants echoing through the streets, the community transformed their shock into organized, peaceful action. Marcus's story quickly became a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had long suffered under similar injustices, whose voices had too often been silenced. His military service added a poignant layer, challenging stereotypes and demanding respect for those who serve the nation regardless of their race. News outlets picked up the story, bringing it from social media into the homes of millions. Interviews with witnesses, experts, and community leaders painted a broader picture of the ongoing struggle against police misconduct and racial profiling. Sarah, Marcus's wife, appeared on a local news program, her composure strong despite her evident pain. "My husband is a hero, not just for his military service, but for standing up to injustice," she said. "We want accountability. We want to make sure no one else has to go through this." The media attention increased pressure on local officials and the police department. The mayor issued a statement promising a full investigation, while police leadership faced tough questions about training, oversight, and past complaints against Officer Bennett. Behind the scenes, Marcus's legal team prepared to file a civil rights lawsuit. Their goal was clear: to seek justice for Marcus, expose systemic flaws, and push for meaningful reform. Yet even as the community mobilized, feelings were mixed. Some expressed skepticism, wary of promises without action. Others worried about backlash or violence, hoping for peaceful progress rather than chaos. In the midst of this turmoil, Marcus remained a figure of calm determination. "I'm not fighting just for myself," he told a local reporter. "I'm fighting for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. This is bigger than me." His message resonated widely, reminding people that change begins with courage, that shining a light on injustice is the first step toward a fairer future. The community's response was a powerful reminder. Silence is complicity. When witnesses speak up, when stories are shared, when people come together, the tide can turn. From shock to action, Marcus's encounter had ignited a spark, of one that would challenge a system long resistant to change and inspire a movement for justice that could not be ignored. When the shocking footage of Marcus's encounter with Officer Derek Bennett went viral, public pressure mounted for a swift and thorough investigation. The city officials promised transparency, and the police department's internal affairs unit was assigned to take the lead. But beneath the surface, a complicated web of loyalty, fear, and institutional resistance awaited. Internal affairs, often referred to as the thin blue line, it is meant to serve as the watchdog within police forces, tasked with holding officers accountable for misconduct. Yet time and again, critics have pointed to the challenges this unit faces when investigating one of their own. The system is riddled with conflicting interests, loyalty to colleagues, the culture of silence, and a fear of retaliation. Within days of the incident, investigator Angela Martinez was assigned the case. A seasoned officer herself, Angela had built a reputation for fairness and tenacity. She was well aware of the pressures she would face, both from within the department and from outside watchdog groups. Her first step was to gather all available evidence. The video was undeniable, but she also knew that body camera footage, radio communications, and witness statements were crucial. What disturbed her was the history in Bennett's file: multiple complaints over the years, verging for aggressive behavior and allegations of racial bias. None of these complaints had resulted in serious disciplinary action. Angela sat in her small office poring over the case files late into the night. She made a phone call to one of Bennett's former partners, hoping to understand the officer's behavior pattern. "Look, I'm not here to paint a villain," Angela said carefully, "but I need the truth. Have you seen signs of trouble with Bennett before?" The former partner sighed, hesitant. "There's a code, you know. We don't rat each other out easily. But yeah, he's got a temper. And people of color sometimes, well, it's like he sees them differently. I never felt comfortable speaking up." That admission struck a chord with Angela. It was a familiar story. The blue wall of silence, the unofficial vow among officers to protect each other at all costs, even if it means covering up wrongdoing. This unspoken rule makes internal affairs investigations especially difficult. Days passed and Angela felt the weight of scrutiny. Some officers resented her for digging too deep, whispering warnings behind her back. "You're one of us or you're against us," was the common refrain. At one point, a superior summoned Angela to a tense meeting. "We need to be careful," he cautioned. "This case is attracting media attention. We can't afford to let morale slip or create divisions." Angela's resolve hardened. She knew the stakes were high, not just for Marcus, but for every person who might face abuse of power in the future. She pressed on. The investigation uncovered troubling inconsistencies. Officers who arrived late to the scene gave conflicting accounts. Reports about whether Bennett activated his body camera were vague and eventually revealed that the camera was off during the critical moments. The internal affairs team interviewed community members and civil rights advocates who expressed deep distrust of the department. "We've seen this before," said a local activist. "Complaints pile up, but nothing changes. Accountability is a distant promise." Despite the obstacles, Angela was determined to recommend charges. She compiled a detailed report outlining violations of protocol, excessive use of force, and racial profiling. The report also criticized the department's failure to address Bennett's past behavior. Her findings sparked internal debate. Some officials pushed to quietly settle the matter, fearing the public fallout. But the mayor's office, under intense public pressure, demanded full transparency. Angela stood before a disciplinary hearing testifying to the evidence she had gathered. The system protects its own, sometimes at the expense of justice, she said. If we want real reform, we must break that cycle. The hearing concluded with Bennett suspended without pay, pending criminal investigation. The police chief issued a public apology, promising reforms in training and oversight. Yet whispers within the force suggested the battle was far from over. Officers loyal to Bennett circulated petitions claiming he was being unfairly targeted. The divide within the department became palpable. For Marcus and his family, the investigation was a bittersweet victory. They saw it as a necessary step, but the scars of trauma and distrust ran deep. Marcus's attorney remarked, "Internal affairs can be a double-edged sword. It's meant to protect the public, but it often struggles against the very culture it exists within." Community leaders echoed this sentiment, calling for independent oversight boards to ensure impartiality. Angela Martinez's story was emblematic of a larger truth. The fight for justice often faces resistance from within, and those brave enough to stand up confront an uphill battle. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that accountability would require more than just one officer facing consequences. It would demand a reckoning with the system itself, its policies, culture, and unspoken rules. This chapter in Marcus's story was a powerful reminder. Change is difficult, slow, but possible. And it begins when individuals dare to challenge the status quo, even when the odds seem stacked against them. In every story of struggle, there are those quiet heroes who stand up against the tide. Within the walls of the police department, amid the shadows of systemic bias and long-standing traditions, there are officers who refuse to be silent. These are the officers of conscience, officers of color, as well as allies of all backgrounds, who confront racism head-on, even when it means risking their careers and reputations. Among them is Officer Marcus Hill, a 42-year-old African-American veteran with over 15 years of service. Marcus's journey into law enforcement was fueled by a desire to make a difference to protect communities like his own that had long suffered neglect and abuse. Yet what he found inside the department was a culture often resistant to change, one that sometimes seemed more intent on protecting its own than serving justice. One afternoon in a small break room tucked away in the precinct, Marcus gathered with a few trusted colleagues. These were officers who had seen too many injustices, who had endured the sting of silence when speaking out. The conversation was cautious, measured, but charged with a shared commitment. "We can't keep ignoring what's happening," Marcus said, his voice steady but intense. "Every day people are hurt, sometimes physically, sometimes in ways you don't see, and we're the ones who can stop it." Beside him sat Officer Emily Rodriguez, a Latina woman who had risen quickly through the ranks. Emily had faced her own battles with prejudice, both from the community and within the force. She nodded in agreement. "It's more than just stopping bad behavior," she added. "We need to change how we think. About race, about power, about who we serve. It's about culture. And culture is the hardest thing to change." Their small group became a nucleus of change, meeting in secret, at times sharing stories, pooling experiences. They drafted proposals for training programs focused on bias awareness. They reached out to community leaders, building bridges where suspicion had long ruled. But the path was far from smooth. Officers who spoke up faced subtle reprisals, being passed over for promotions, sidelined in assignments, whispered about in the hallways. The unspoken rule was clear. Loyalty to the group came before truth. One day, Marcus found a note slipped under his locker, a simple phrase, "Traitor." It was a harsh reminder of the risks involved. But instead of deterring him, it steeled his resolve. "We're not traitors," Marcus told Emily one evening after a long day. "We're the future. If we don't push now, who will?" Their efforts began to gain momentum outside the department as well. Local activists and civil rights groups took notice, offering support and amplifying their message. Together, they called for the creation of independent oversight committees and more transparent disciplinary processes. Officer Rodriguez spoke at a community forum, her voice strong and clear. "We know the system has failed many, but inside there are those of us fighting to make it right. We ask for your trust, your patience, and your partnership." Their stories echoed those of other brave officers nationwide, those who challenged systemic racism, not from outside protests, but from within the very institutions often criticized. They understood the complexity of their roles, balancing duty with conscience, brotherhood with justice. Yet the question remained, could they overcome the entrenched culture of silence and resistance? Could allies within the force be the catalyst for true reform? This internal movement offered a glimmer of hope amid the turmoil. It reminded the community that change requires more than outrage. It requires solidarity, persistence, and the courage to stand against the currents of tradition. For Marcus, Emily, and their fellow officers, the battle was personal and professional. They carried the burden of their badge with pride, but also with the awareness that true justice demands accountability from every corner of the system. Their alliance was a testament to the power of unity in diversity, showing that even in places where prejudice seemed entrenched, the human spirit could inspire transformation. As Marcus reflected one night, looking out over the city lights, he knew the road ahead was long. But with allies at his side, the fight for a just police force was far from over. The courtroom was packed that morning, tension thick enough to choke the air. Marcus Johnson sat quietly, his hands folded on his lap, eyes steady but mind racing. Today marked the beginning of a battle that stretched far beyond him, one that challenged a deeply entrenched system. For months, Marcus and his legal team had prepared for this moment. The lawsuit was not just a pursuit of personal justice, but a call for accountability that echoed through communities nationwide. The case was set against a backdrop of systemic obstacles, powerful forces determined to protect their own, to maintain a status quo that rarely favored those who dared to speak out. His lead attorney, Karen Ellis, a seasoned civil rights lawyer known for her tenacity, paced the room before court. This isn't just about one man, she said, her voice firm, yet empathetic. It's about shining a light on injustice that has been allowed to fester in the shadows for far too long. From the outset, the legal battle was anything but straightforward. The defense team wielded every tactic to derail the case. They questioned Marcus's credibility, tried to minimize the significance of the evidence, and leaned heavily on the well-worn narrative that painted police officers as heroes under siege. The first hearing saw fierce exchanges. The courtroom became a battleground where words cut like knives. Prosecutors brought forward witness testimonies that corroborated Marcus's account, neighbors who heard the confrontation, passers-by who recorded the incident on their phones. The videos were raw and unfiltered, exposing the harsh reality of the encounter. Yet the defense countered with claims of procedural justification, citing vague policies to justify the officers' actions. They attempted to depict Marcus as confrontational despite his composed demeanor on that fateful day. It was a stark reminder of how narratives could be twisted depending on who held the microphone. Outside the courthouse, protests flared, signaling the community's restless demand for justice. Signs waved in the air, voices rose in chants, and the local media thrummed with coverage. Marcus's family stood at the front lines, their pain evident, but their resolve unbroken. His wife, Teresa, held their two young children close, whispering words of comfort even as her eyes betrayed her fear. The legal team faced mounting pressures. Documents were delayed, key witnesses intimidated, and some crucial evidence initially withheld. Each obstacle was a test of their endurance, a reminder that the system was resistant to change. In one particularly intense pretrial hearing, Karen confronted the prosecutor. "Are we here to seek truth or to protect those who abuse their power?" she demanded. The room fell silent, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Marcus's story became a beacon for others. Civil rights organizations lent support, mobilizing resources and experts to back the case. The narrative shifted from isolated incident to emblematic fight against systemic abuse. Behind the scenes, Marcus often reflected on the journey. "It's exhausting," he confided to a close friend. "But if I don't stand for this, who will? This fight isn't just for me, it's for every person who's been silenced." His legal team worked tirelessly, dissecting every clause, preparing for every possible counterattack. They knew that winning this case required more than just facts. It demanded exposing uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and prejudice. The courtroom drama intensified as the trial unfolded over weeks. Marcus's testimony was calm but powerful, his voice carrying the weight of experience and pain. He spoke not just of the incident, but of the long history of marginalization, the struggle of serving a country that often failed to protect him. Each day brought new revelations, internal memos, past complaints against the officer, inconsistencies in official reports, all weaving a picture of a system that had failed in its duty. Still, the defense fought fiercely, attempting to paint the officers as victims of public scrutiny, grappling with difficult decisions under pressure. But the tide was turning. As closing arguments approached, the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Karen's final plea was a call for justice not only for Marcus, but for the countless others caught in similar circumstances. This case, she declared, is a turning point. It's a chance to hold those in power accountable and begin healing the fractures in our community. The judge listened intently, the weight of the moment palpable. Outside, the community awaited the verdict, their hopes and fears intertwined. Marcus's legal battle was far from over, but each step forward was a testament to resilience. It was a story of courage in the face of adversity, a demand for change that refused to be silenced. In that courtroom, with every piece of evidence laid bare, Marcus's quest for justice illuminated a path for many, proving that even in the darkest moments, truth and determination could spark the possibility of real transformation. The city streets buzzed with anticipation and quiet determination. News of Marcus Johnson's courtroom battle had rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse, sparking a wave of peaceful protests and social movements that would forever change the narrative of justice in their community. It began simply a few dozen people gathered outside the city hall, holding handmade signs that read, "Justice for Marcus, End Police Abuse, and Equality Now." But the small crowd quickly swelled into hundreds. Word spread through social media, texts, and community networks. By sunset, thousands had come together, a sea of faces united by a shared demand for accountability and change. The atmosphere was charged yet calm. Chants echoed through the streets, rising in waves, "No justice, no peace." The rhythmic pounding of drums intertwined with the voices of mothers, fathers, students, veterans, and activists. Their messages were clear, peaceful but unyielding. They refused to be silenced. Among the crowd stood several well-known civil rights organizations, their banners proudly displayed. Leaders from these groups took to makeshift stages, addressing the crowd with powerful speeches that recalled historic moments in the fight for equality, from the marches of the 1960s to the more recent protests following tragedies that had shaken the nation. "I stand here not just for Marcus, but for every person who has ever felt the sting of injustice," said Angela Martinez, a community organizer. Her voice was steady, but filled with passion. "We are here to remind the powers that be that this time we will not look away. This time we demand real change." Local clergy joined the movement, offering prayers and words of comfort. Reverend Samuel Hayes spoke of healing and hope, calling the community to unite in love despite the pain they had endured. His words moved many to tears, binding the crowd together in shared resolve. Social media became the amplifier of their voices. Live streams broadcast every chant, every speech, every moment of peaceful solidarity. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and #Stand With Marcus trended nationwide, connecting people from all corners of the country. Celebrities, activists, and everyday citizens shared the story, broadening the reach far beyond Washington Heights. This visibility brought pressure to local officials. City council members found themselves in the spotlight, receiving calls, emails, and even visits from concerned constituents demanding action. Media outlets shifted from reporting isolated incidents to covering the growing movement, framing it as a pivotal moment for justice reform. Mayor Helen Brooks, facing increasing public demand, convened emergency meetings with law enforcement leaders, community representatives, and activists. In a televised address, she acknowledged the pain and frustration that fueled the protests. "We hear you. We see you," she said solemnly. "This city is committed to change, and we will work tirelessly to earn back your trust." But the movement was cautious. Organizers emphasized that their fight was not for fleeting political gestures, but for systemic reform. They pushed for concrete policy changes, mandatory body cameras, independent civilian oversight boards, better training on racial bias, and more transparency and disciplinary actions within the police force. Marcus's family emerged as symbols of resilience and hope. Teresa Johnson, Marcus's wife spoke at several rallies, her voice steady, despite the weight of her family's trauma. "This isn't just about my husband," she said. "It's about every family that has ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. Together we are stronger." Her words resonated deeply. Stories poured in from people sharing their own experiences with systemic discrimination and abuse. The movement became not just about one man's story, but about a collective demand for respect, dignity, and safety. Local artists contributed painting murals that depicted Marcus's courage alongside historic figures in the struggle for civil rights. Musicians composed songs that played during protests, their lyrics weaving the pain and hope of the community into a powerful soundtrack of change. Despite moments of tension and opposition, some from factions resistant to change, the overwhelming majority of protests remained peaceful. Police presence was strong, but measured an intentional effort to avoid escalation. This shift in dynamics reflected the impact of the community's persistent peaceful advocacy. Over weeks, the movement organized community forums, town halls, and educational workshops. These events created spaces for dialogue between residents, law enforcement, and policymakers. The conversations were honest, sometimes painful, but essential. Trust began to build slowly, brick by brick. The unity forged in these protests became a catalyst for tangible reforms. Several city council members introduced bills reflecting the movement's demands. The community's collective voice translated into legislative action, proving the power of organized, peaceful resistance. Through it all, Marcus remained humble, yet determined. "I never wanted to be the face of this fight," he admitted in an interview. "But if my experience can spark change, if it can save someone else from what I went through, then this struggle is worth it." The protests and movements that swelled in response to Marcus's case were more than just reactions. They were the heartbeat of a community refusing to accept injustice. They embodied hope, courage, and a relentless belief that through solidarity, change was not just possible, but inevitable. As the crowd marched, their voices rising in unison, one thing was clear: this was not the end of their story. It was a beginning, a powerful declaration that the community would no longer stand silently in the shadows, but would speak loudly, demand accountability, and shape a future where justice truly belongs to all. The courthouse stood tall, a silent fortress of justice, its steps already crowded early that morning with reporters, family members, and community supporters. The air was thick with anticipation and the weight of what was to come, the day Marcus Johnson's fight for justice would enter the solemn halls of the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was a mix of tension and quiet resolve. Marcus sat in the front row, flanked by his legal team and his family. His face was calm, but his eyes revealed a storm of emotions, nerves, determination, and the burden of carrying not only his own story, but the hopes of an entire community. As the judge entered, everyone rose, a ritual marking the beginning of what many hoped would be a turning point. The gavel struck, echoing through the room, signaling the official start of the trial. The prosecution opened with a powerful statement, laying out their case with precision and passion. They painted a vivid picture of that fateful day, how Officer Derek Bennett, driven by bias and unchecked authority, targeted Marcus without cause. The prosecutor's voice rang clear as they detailed the abuse of power, the violation of Marcus's rights, and the profound impact on his life. "We are here to seek justice for Marcus Johnson," the prosecutor declared. "This case is not just about one man. It is about holding those who abuse their badges accountable, about restoring faith in a system that has too often failed our communities." The defense countered, presenting a narrative aimed at justifying Bennett's actions. They argued that the officer acted within his duties, emphasizing protocol and suggesting that Marcus's military background may have contributed to a misunderstanding. Their tone was clinical, trying to sow doubt about the intent behind the confrontation. Marcus was the first witness called to the stand. Rising with quiet strength, he recounted the moments that changed his life forever. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of his experience. "I was walking home," Marcus began, "when Officer Bennett stopped me without reason. I showed him respect and complied, but he escalated the situation without cause. I served this country. I wore the uniform to protect others. Yet that day I felt powerless. I felt fear." The courtroom listened rapt as Marcus described not only the physical intimidation, but the emotional toll, the humiliation, the sense of betrayal by those sworn to protect and serve. Following Marcus, several witnesses testified. Bystanders who had recorded the incident spoke of shock and disbelief. A fellow veteran testified to Marcus's character and the unjust treatment he endured. Experts on police conduct analyzed Bennett's actions, highlighting how they violated both department policies and constitutional rights. Throughout the testimonies, moments of raw emotion surfaced. Teresa Johnson, Marcus's wife, described the nights of worry, the anxiety of not knowing what justice would bring. "We felt invisible," she said, voice breaking. "But today, standing here, I feel hope." The defense attempted to challenge these accounts, questioning the credibility of witnesses and emphasizing the stress officers face daily. Their aim was to shift sympathy back towards Bennett, painting him as a man trapped in a difficult job. But the prosecution was relentless, skillfully weaving the evidence and testimonies into a compelling argument for accountability. They underscored the broader implications, the need for systemic change, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the human cost of prejudice. Outside the courtroom, crowds gathered waiting for updates, their faces reflecting the high stakes. The media coverage amplified the trial's significance, framing it as a test not just of one officer's guilt, but of the very ideals of justice and equality. As the day drew to a close, Marcus returned to his seat, exhausted but resolute. The voices that echoed in that courtroom carried more than just words. They carried the demand for change, the cry for recognition, and the hope for a future where no one would suffer the injustice he faced. The trial was just beginning, but the first day had already shifted something fundamental. It was a moment when stories were told, truths unveiled, and the course toward justice was set in motion. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the trial entered a new unexpected chapter. The usual faces of lawyers, witnesses, and reporters were joined by a figure whose presence alone sent ripples through the crowd. General Marcus Davis, a four-star general with decades of service behind him, and more importantly, a former colleague and mentor to Marcus Johnson. As General Davis entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. His uniform, adorned with medals and insignias of honor, stood in stark contrast to the grim atmosphere. Yet beneath the polished exterior was a man burdened with regret, prepared to confront the painful realities that had unfolded. Taking the stand, General Davis began with a voice steady but laced with emotion. "I come here today not only as a witness, but as someone who owes Marcus a profound apology." He stated, his eyes scanning the room, locking briefly with Marcus's. "What happened to him, to one of our own, a man who has served this country with honor, is unacceptable. It is a betrayal not only of Marcus, but of the very values we uphold in the military and society." This apology was more than words. It was a seismic shift in the narrative, an acknowledgement from within the ranks of power that injustice had taken place. General Davis's testimony detailed the professional relationship he had shared with Marcus, the respect they held for each other, the battles fought side by side, and the qualities that defined Marcus as a soldier and as a man. "I have seen Marcus in the heat of battle under pressure few can imagine. He has shown courage, integrity, and resilience," Davis said. "To see him treated this way by those sworn to protect cuts deeply. I stand here today to say on behalf of those who served that this was wrong. We must do better. We will do better." His words resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. For many, it was a powerful symbol, a high-ranking military officer publicly condemning police misconduct, bridging two worlds often seen as separate or even at odds. It validated Marcus's experience in a way that few could, offering a voice of authority that challenged the silence and denial often surrounding these cases. The general's presence brought a new layer of gravity to the proceedings. It reminded everyone listening that Marcus was not just a victim, he was a respected figure, a leader, and a symbol of perseverance against systemic failures. This moment also opened a conversation about the deep-rooted issues within institutions tasked with upholding justice and security. If someone of General Davis's stature recognized the injustice, what did that say about the broader system? How many more voices like Marcus's remained unheard? As the trial progressed, the courtroom felt a shift, a collective realization that this case was not just about one incident, but about confronting uncomfortable truths. General Davis's apology was a call to action, a reminder that change requires acknowledgement before it can begin. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly. Social media buzzed with clips of the general's testimony, sparking discussions nationwide. Veterans, activists, and citizens alike shared their support, inspired by the courage it took for such a figure to step forward. For Marcus, the general's apology was a balm to wounds long felt but seldom acknowledged. It offered not just vindication, but hope that his story might serve as a catalyst for broader change and that his struggle was not in vain. This unexpected ally's voice became a beacon, shining light on the dark corners of injustice and opening pathways for healing and reform. It was a reminder that even within rigid hierarchies and institutions, humanity and accountability can prevail. The trial continued with renewed vigor, fueled by this profound act of solidarity. General Marcus Davis's apology was more than a moment. It was a turning point, a testament to the power of truth spoken boldly and the beginning of a journey toward justice that no one involved could ignore. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the focus shifted to the darker shadows behind the badge, the systemic failures that allowed Officer Derek Bennett's behavior to persist unchecked for years. The evidence unfolded like a dam breaking, revealing not just a single incident of misconduct, but a cascade of ignored warnings and institutional blind spots. Derek Bennett's personnel file was laid bare before the jury. It told a troubling story. 6 formal complaints filed over a span of 7 years, all alleging excessive force, racial profiling, and hostile conduct. Yet each complaint had been quietly dismissed or downplayed. No significant disciplinary actions were ever taken. No retraining, no suspension, no meaningful consequences. The reasons given ranged from lack of sufficient evidence to officers' good standing and even conflicting witness testimonies. But behind these bureaucratic phrases was a culture that shielded its own, a blue wall of silence that prioritized protecting officers over protecting the public. One of the prosecutors stepped forward to emphasize the broader implications. This isn't just about Derek Bennett. It's about a system that enables and even encourages abuse of power. When complaints like these are ignored, when officers are allowed to continue without accountability, it sends a message the badge can be a shield for misconduct. Comparisons to other high-profile cases came into sharp relief. The names echoed through the courtroom: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner. Each represented a painful reminder of how systemic failures in policing can cost lives and tear communities apart. The parallels were chilling. Officers with histories of complaints or questionable behavior continuing to serve without intervention, emboldened by a lack of oversight. The defense tried to argue that Bennett's past complaints were isolated incidents, each unique and insufficient to draw conclusions about his character. But the prosecution countered with a comprehensive analysis of patterns of unchecked aggression, implicit bias, and institutional failure. Experts testified on police culture, explaining how the code of silence works. Officers are often reluctant to report colleagues for fear of retaliation or ostracism. Internal affairs departments, while tasked with investigations, are frequently underfunded, understaffed, or influenced by political pressures. This environment fosters a status quo where misconduct can thrive beneath the surface. A psychologist specializing in law enforcement behavior shed light on the psychological toll this culture takes on both officers and communities. When power is left unchecked, it distorts judgment and increases the likelihood of abuse. For officers like Bennett, repeated tolerance of bad behavior can normalize aggression and racial bias, leading to tragic outcomes. Meanwhile, community leaders testified about the damage this unchecked power had done to the neighborhood of Washington Heights. Residents spoke of fear, mistrust, and the trauma of repeated encounters with law enforcement that felt more like harassment than protection. One woman recounted, "We've seen officers come and go, but the stories stay the same. My son was stopped without cause more times than I can count. It's not just one bad apple. It's a whole orchard that needs clearing." The courtroom absorbed the weight of these testimonies. The narrative was clear: Derek Bennett's actions were not aberrations, but symptoms of systemic rot. As the evidence continued, a former police chief was called to the stand. He acknowledged the department's shortcomings candidly. There were failures at multiple levels: supervision, accountability, and training. The mechanisms that should have prevented this behavior either didn't exist or were ignored. He also detailed recent reforms implemented in response to public outcry, including body-worn cameras, civilian oversight committees, and bias training. But he cautioned real change requires cultural transformation, not just policy tweaks. It's about changing hearts and minds inside the force. This testimony resonated deeply, highlighting the tension between superficial fixes and the deep-rooted changes necessary for true justice. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, the courtroom felt the profound significance of the moment. This case was more than the story of one officer and one victim. It was an indictment of an entire system that had failed both. Marcus's legal team summarized the core message: justice for Marcus is justice for every community harmed by unchecked police power. Until we address these systemic failures, these injustices will continue. The jury left to deliberate with a heavy burden. The hope was that their decision would signal not only accountability for Derek Bennett, but a call to dismantle the structures that allowed him to act with impunity. Outside the courthouse, activists and citizens gathered, echoing the courtroom's call for systemic reform. The conversation was no longer just about individual acts of racism or violence, but about a culture and system in desperate need of change. As night fell over Washington Heights, the fight for justice continued, not only for Marcus, but for all who had been silenced or marginalized by a system meant to protect them. In the quiet corners of their modest home, away from the glaring spotlight of the courtroom and media frenzy, Marcus's family waged a battle of their own, a struggle that was no less profound, no less painful. His wife, Angela, a soft-spoken woman of 34 years, bore the weight of this ordeal with a strength that often went unseen. Two young children, ages 6 and 8, clung to their mother, sensing the tension in the air, though unable to fully understand its origins. Angela sat by the kitchen window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes distant yet resolute. She thought back to the day it all began, the moment Marcus was stopped, harassed, and humiliated in their neighborhood. The community they called home, once a place of comfort and familiarity, suddenly felt alien and unsafe. It wasn't just the incident itself, Angela would later say in a rare interview. It was the ripple effect, the fear, the sleepless nights, the constant worry for Marcus's safety and for our children's future. We had to learn to live with a kind of pain that isn't visible. The psychological toll on the family was immense. Marcus's trauma reverberated through their daily lives. Angela described nights where Marcus would wake up gasping, reliving the confrontation, his body trembling with the echoes of fear and anger. The children, too young to grasp the full gravity, showed signs of anxiety, hesitant to go outside, asking questions about why their father was suddenly so distant. School meetings, therapy sessions, and whispered conversations in support groups became part of their routine. Angela herself sought counseling to cope with the overwhelming pressure, both emotional and societal. There were days when I felt completely alone, she confessed. People would say, "He's a soldier, he can handle it." But they don't see the family behind the uniform, the ones who carry the scars too. The social stigma surrounding police brutality cases added another layer of hardship. Friends and neighbors, divided in their opinions, often treated the family with suspicion or silence. Some whispered doubts, suggesting Marcus might have provoked the incident, reflecting a common but misguided narrative that blames victims rather than addressing systemic issues. Yet through it all, Angela's voice remained a pillar of resilience. "We chose not to be broken," she said. "Our children deserve to grow up knowing their father is a hero, not a suspect. We had to fight not just for Marcus, but for them, for their sense of justice and safety." Marcus's younger brother Jamal also played a crucial role in supporting the family. He recalled late-night talks where Marcus expressed feelings of helplessness and frustration. Jamal's presence was a reminder that the fight extended beyond one man. It was a family affair. "Marcus isn't just fighting for himself," Jamal said. "He's fighting for all of us, for our community, for every family that's been hurt by this system." The family's struggle illuminated a side of police brutality often overlooked, the intimate personal battles faced by loved ones. It revealed how trauma extends beyond the immediate victim, infiltrating homes, relationships, and futures. Despite the emotional weight, the family found moments of hope. Small victories in court public support rallies and heartfelt messages from strangers offered glimmers of light. Angela described the strength drawn from these moments as fuel to keep moving forward. "We are not victims," she insisted. "We are survivors, and our story is far from over." Marcus's journey to recovery began not in a hospital, but in the quiet moments after the storm, when the cameras stopped rolling, the courtroom emptied, and the noise of public outrage dimmed. The physical wounds from that fateful day, though painful, were minor compared to the invisible scars etched deep into his mind and soul. PTSD had wrapped its heavy cloak around him, a silent adversary that no metal or rank could shield him from. At first, Marcus found himself trapped in a cycle of restless nights and haunting memories. The simple act of stepping outside triggered flashes of that confrontation with Officer Derek Bennett, the harsh words, the unjust treatment, the overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Even the familiar streets of his neighborhood transformed into a maze of anxiety and fear. He felt isolated, as if the world saw only the uniform he once wore, not the man beneath it grappling with trauma. Angela watched her husband struggle, her heart aching with each silent tear he shed. "There were days when he seemed miles away," she recalls softly. "I knew he was there physically, but his mind was caught in that moment over and over." Determined to support Marcus, Angela encouraged him to seek help, a journey that took courage as profound as any battlefield. Marcus reached out to a psychologist specializing in trauma, someone who understood the unique burdens carried by veterans and victims of police violence alike. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a compassionate and experienced therapist, became a guiding light. "Marcus's resilience was remarkable," she explains, "but trauma rewires the brain. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about learning to live with it and reclaiming control." Their sessions delved into painful memories,